You can ask me any question. I'm perfectly happy to answer and give you my idea, and I'm sure my husband won't mind at all.
I'll never forget the day that I was told I would have to have a mastectomy.
The Equal Rights Amendment is a necessity of life.
I'm Betty Ford, and I'm an alcoholic.
Empowered by facing her own demons, Betty Ford changed the way Americans view addiction and women's health. Having been thrust in the limelight as the spouse of a prominent conservative political figure, Mrs. Ford faced stress and public scrutiny, especially when becoming the First Lady.
I told my husband, if we have to go to the White House, okay, I will go. But I'm going as myself.
She stood up against prejudices that were born out of the misunderstandings of mental health and shattered stereotypes of addiction by becoming the face of a secret struggle. Her fearless and outspoken persona led her to tackle her private addiction and other controversial issues which she purposely and courageously took out of the shadows.
There is help available.
This is Betty Ford, candidly standing strong. Married to Gerald Ford, a rising star in the Republican Party, Mrs. Ford faced greater pressure as her role became more public. In her mission to educate all women about politics and support women's progress, she got involved in the Congressional Club. The emotional strain and overwhelming responsibilities of playing mother, father, and political wife resulted in muscle spasms so debilitating, doctors prescribed Valium. This, along with alcohol, would become her private crutch.
I tried to combine all that pain medication with drinking at social events, but it was having a very strong impact.
At first you're in denial about those things, and even within the family you don't talk about it.
Being exhausted and unsatisfied from devoting her life to her husband's career, Mrs. Ford decided to seek professional help, but did not address her addiction to painkillers.
I was kind of being left behind.
It was very scary when she had a breakdown.
When Vice President Agnew was accused of accepting bribes and President Nixon's Watergate scandal was simultaneously gaining publicity, Americans lost hope in their elected officials. President Nixon had to choose a family that would be completely honest and revive faith in the American system. The Fords were his choice. Mrs. Ford held numerous interviews to help the nation accept the sudden replacement of the vice president. As Second Lady, she remained outspoken and confirmed her passion for women's rights.
Well, I would say I am for women's lib because I feel very strongly a woman should certainly receive equal pay as any man would. I think I'm a feminist, really.
Mrs. Ford set the precedent of expressing political beliefs on controversial issues for political wives. One of the most taboo topics that Mrs. Ford addressed was abortion, which most First Ladies did not take sides on.
I feel very strongly that it was the best thing in the world when the Supreme Court voted to legalize abortion.
Even though the media admired the new second family, the family's positivity was overshadowed by the Watergate scandal. On August 8, 1974, Nixon resigned and Vice President Gerald Ford reluctantly became president.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Gerald Ford became the first president to ever mention the First Lady in his inaugural speech.
I am indebted to no man, and only to one woman, my dear wife.
The overload of responsibilities of the First Lady made Mrs. Ford even more dependent on painkillers.
The burden and responsibilities of assuming the role of First Lady would be very confining.
To further add to the stress of being First Lady, Mrs. Ford was diagnosed with breast cancer. She did not want to cover up her illness after the nation had just begun to heal from the dishonesty of the Watergate scandal.
My husband, when he was sworn in, had made it very clear there would be no cover-up.
After her mastectomy, Mrs. Ford was candid about her condition, something that was unprecedented.
I just returned from the hospital where I saw Betty. Dr. Lukash has assured me that she came through the operation all right.
In the 1970s, breast cancer was the leading cause of death for women aged 40 to 45, yet less than half of these women were receiving regular exams. Within a week of Mrs. Ford's disclosure, however, Tens of thousands of women went in for mammograms. It was in that moment that Mrs. Ford realized that taking a stand could save lives. Breast cancer was seen as a shameful disease until Mrs. Ford humanized it.
I was kind of amazed that I was this important person.
Continuing to take a stand for women's health, Mrs. Ford once again came out in her support for the pro-choice movement. Initially, Mrs. Ford received 28,000 letters denouncing her stand, but her letters of support flooded in because she proved that women did not have to agree with their husbands. Coming out in support of abortion rights did not prevent her from being selected for the Times Women of the Year list. Mrs. Ford used this newfound attention to her advantage by campaigning for the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. She directly contacted senators and local politicians to encourage them to vote on the ERA.
Certainly equal rights and equal pay.
In his run for the 1974 presidency, Gerald Ford's slogans were tied to his very popular wife, but lost the election to Jimmy Carter. Her dependence on painkillers and alcohol grew as Gerald's post-presidential life kept him away. Daughter Susan gathered the family to address Betty's alcoholism.
I could see her going downhill quickly.
Patricia Riley of the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation explained why it was so difficult for Mrs. Ford to admit her addiction.
Women who are the primary caregiver in a family find it difficult to leave their family. There's also a lot of shame and guilt.
If we hadn't gone through the intervention process, I'm sure that Mother would have died.
The bravery she showed after the intervention led her to seek treatment at the Long Beach Naval Hospital. Channeling her influence as former First Lady, Mrs. Ford raised millions of dollars to open the Betty Ford Center for Alcohol Rehabilitation. Mrs. Ford opened her clinic in 1982. She wanted to make a center that welcomed women because most centers at the time did not.
Women who were in women-only halls and the men that were in men-only halls were doing better.
30 years ago, she raised her hand and said, "My name is Betty, I'm an alcoholic," which changed the face of alcoholism back in the late 70s.
But I think it was about helping other people. She would go over there daily and sit with patients and talk to them, share experiences, and provide hope.
In Mrs. Ford's later years, she continued to make changes. She lobbied Congress for health care coverage and wrote a book discussing her path to rehabilitation. Later, she received the Presidential Medal of Freedom because she humanized addiction. For one of the first times, the First Lady left a standing legacy.
We honor her as a recovery champion, unafraid to break taboos and to speak about issues that affect the lives of millions.
Although Mrs. Ford passed away in 2011, her frankness is still one of the core values of the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation. Being one of the millions affected by Mrs. Ford's legacy, Jeremiah Gardner decided to work for the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation after recovering himself.
If I could say one thing to Betty Ford, it would be thank you. Mrs. Ford let the world know that she had addiction long before it became okay to do so. That really changed the world. Addiction has been stigmatized as a moral failing, as something that afflicts bad people. So to have somebody like Mrs. Ford say that, no, I'm affected by this disease too, it instantly made it easier for people to ask for help. It made it easier for me to call my friend and ask for help.
The foundation shows that 80% of their patients experience improved family relationships and mental health.
There's a tremendous change in patients, physically, mentally, emotionally, that our clinicians see.
By destigmatizing two of the most shameful diseases, breast cancer and addiction, Mrs. Ford's frankness and bravery left a 35-year standing legacy with the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation, which has changed the lives of millions of Americans.
If I had not found recovery from my own addiction to prescription drugs and to alcohol, I would not have lived to see this day. I know that treatment works, that it saves lives, because it saved mine.